I think I'm going to make a start for our final closing panel. So we, on this panel, who I'll introduce in a moment, have the wonderful challenge of drawing together the many different threads that have been explored over the course of these 2 days into hopefully some inspiring and energizing conclusions. So the gauntlet is down, and we will do our best. Before we start, though, I want to do a little social experiment of my own. So if I could ask all of you who are in the room just to stand up for me to start with. I think the panel could stand as well. Why not? Yeah. Okay. Now, if you feel, I would like you to sit down if you feel the following. If you feel like you can go into the office, wherever that may be in the world, on Monday morning, and know exactly what you need to do next in order to solve complex social issues, please take a seat. Good, okay, that's what I thought. So we've done a great job of confusing everybody. Okay, you can all sit down now, thank you.
You're going to go through the week.
Obviously just a bit of fun, but I think, the one thing that I've certainly learned over the last 2 days is there are no easy answers to any of these things. And I think, there's what I've enjoyed the most and what I'm really sort of pleased with about this conference is there have been such a rich array of contrasting perspectives and opinions, all of which I think draw their validity and legitimacy from different places and different experiences. And that's what makes this such an exciting and rich conference, in my opinion. I think that all of the opinions are valid, but they're coming from very different places, and I think that's really exciting and gives us all a lot to think about going forward. But I think what we wanted to do on this panel was really be pragmatic and think, okay, well, we've done a lot of thinking, but on Monday we do all seriously need to go back to the doing, don't we? So we do need to find some sort of clarity in the complexity. So let's get pragmatic, and let's get pragmatic with my 4 esteemed panelists. So to my left, this is John Tambornino, who we met yesterday. He was in the chair for the closing session yesterday. Welcome back, John. Abha is from the British Asian Trust, and I hope you're all excited as I am to get a little bit more of that developing world perspective. She'll talk about the South Asian experience around some of these issues. David Hutchinson is the Chief Executive of Social Finance, who have been in and around these issues since the very start. Indeed, the SIB was born with social finance, so a very experienced voice. Yep. You're to blame. And finally, Tom LeQuesne, who's the head of the Inclusive Economy Unit within the Department for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport, part of the British government. So we'll get we started out with the British Civil Service very much giving us inspiration via Stefan Durkin, and Tom will reflect some of those perspectives as well. So to kick us off, we've talked an awful lot about impact bonds over the last couple of days. And love them or hate them, you can't deny that they're arousing emotions, positive and negative. We're still talking about them, we're still talking about them now. So I want to ask you, John, to offer a perspective from your experience in the United States. Why do you think this idea has captured the imagination of some people who are proponents and even opponents? What is it about social impact bonds that seem to particularly arouse these discussions and debates and curiosity?
Feeling aroused just thinking about the question. But first of all, thank you again for having me. First of all, I need to caveat my statements. Nothing I say should be taken as official views or positions of the White House Office of Management and Budget of the U.S. government. I'm just offering my own reflections. I've been in this field for a number of years now, both at the White House and before that at the Department of Health and Human Services. So I'll give kind of a long view of what I've observed pretty close up. Social impact bonds were rechristened as Pay for Success when they came to the U.S., or PFS, around 2011, and this was under President Obama. It was getting a lot of attention by the Obama administration. But this emerged within a broader context and a broader agenda of a focus on evidence-based policymaking broadly, innovation, harnessing data, rigorous evaluation, especially wanting to do these things in the social sector, and partly because this is where these things had most taken root already. So this was seen as the most fertile soil to sort of go to advance to the next step in making progress in this area. And Pay for Success emerged against this backdrop. But there's a particular reason why it really came to the surface the way, to the extent it did. And that was right after the 2010 elections, in which Congress changed control from Democrats to Republicans, in which there was suddenly a kind of an emboldened Republican majority that had a very strong anti-spending, anti-tax agenda. Given the President Obama realized, and his staff and everyone thinking about it, that it was unrealistic to have any new funding for new initiatives. Yet there was a real appetite for new initiatives, particularly in the social sector. So the idea that we could pilot programs and do so with private funding initially and not have to secure additional appropriations from a Congress that was reluctant to provide them had tremendous appeal. It was also the case that there was an atmosphere of austerity. It's been talked about here also. There was, of course, the 2008 financial crisis, but also this new Republican majority in Congress had a very strong anti-tax, anti-spending agenda. There began to be a bipartisan interest in the debt and the deficit. So suddenly the possibility of having a program model that would generate savings was very appealing, and indeed became appealing across partisan divisions. Now, concurrently with this, there was major health reform that was President Obama's signature initiative, the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act of 2010, known as Obamacare. This expanded eligibility greatly in our health care programs. We were one of the OECD countries that didn't have universal insurance before then. And key features of the health care reform were things like that are familiar to us. Payment reform, restructuring financial incentives, shifting financial risk, thinking more smartly about prevention, emphasizing the social determinants of health, greater focus on outcomes, performance, quality metrics, that sort of thing. The law included $10 billion to do experimentation and innovation with new payment models that emphasize these principles. So you had these two things going on in parallel. You had the major health reform passed in 2010 that, due to its complexity, was took several, it's still being implemented, but the first few years were a tremendous challenge in figuring out implementation. And then alongside that, you had Pay for Success getting a lot of attention. And at a deep level, the principles were similar, but they were operating in parallel. There was no convergence of the two, but a lot of people were wanting them to converge because Medicaid is the single largest expenditure for social spending, well, not social spending, but spending for low-income and disadvantaged persons in the U.S. It's half of all social welfare spending. It's the third largest item in the federal budget. It's the second largest item in state budgets. It's $600 billion a year of combined federal-state spending. So it's a big program. And historically, it's paid for a lot of remedial services, paying for sickness, essentially. So you had persons in the Pay for Success field saying, can we unlock Medicaid? It's a massive program. It should be the end payer. And let us do these Pay for Success projects and use that Medicaid funding as the end payer. But we ran into a lot of just complexities, legal and otherwise, in doing that. I'll come back and say more about that if we have time. But let me just talk a little bit more about what happened in the Pay for Success area. As in the UK, there was a lot of interest and attention and energy. It attracted a lot of really smart people. A number of federal projects were launched. Total federal projects and investments in Pay for Success amounted to about $100 million through 2016 across a number of departments and service areas and program issues, which is meaningful, but it's also minuscule. Considering the amount of social welfare spending during that time, which is in the trillions, actually. So it's a minute amount of federal spending had a PFS purpose or program structure. A lot of the spending was for feasibility studies, not to launch a project, but rather to see whether a project was feasible, and often it was determined that the project was infeasible, or for whatever reason the project didn't materialize. Recently, some other larger programs have had pay-for-success provisions incorporated into them. Our home visiting program for pregnant women and new mothers, the major workforce training program. But these are recent provisions, so we've seen very little, nothing really in terms of implementation under these programs. And finally, major legislation was enacted a year ago, legislation that was formulated some years ago, around 2014, and that's the SIPRA legislation, the Social Impact Partnerships to Pay for Results Act, which I recently told someone, they asked me if I'd heard of it. I said, it's my middle name, actually, and it goes nicely. It's got an Italian ring, so it fits very well, actually. What SIPRA does is provide $100 million in flexible funding to seed pay-for-success projects that are initiated by states and localities across 20 program areas. Issues of health, homelessness, housing, disability, welfare, those sorts of things. It reflects the original SIB model that we've been talking about during this conference. There's a very strong emphasis on savings that exceed the total costs. There's a strong requirement for rigorous impact evaluations, preferably with an RCT, those sorts of things. So some observers worry that the legislation, since it was devised in 2014 and then finally enacted in 2018, has a somewhat anachronistic quality, and that the SIB PFS field has really evolved in the U.S., as many of us know, getting away from the SIB model, but wanting to nevertheless sort of advance the SIB and PFS principles. So what SIPRA will allow us to do is to really discover what the potential is, I think, for these SIB PFS projects, the traditional projects, and what the state and local interest is and capacity. That'll allow us to see how many or how few traditional sorts of projects will work, including projects that can rigorously really make a case for the fact that they will generate savings. And not just do so theoretically, but actually will present a compelling explanation of how they'll do so, but also then do a very thorough after-action accounting to say, well, okay, did we indeed prevent diabetes, and did we indeed reduce healthcare costs in a very tangible way? So that's essentially where we are, I think, in the U.S., certainly at the federal level with SIBs and PFS. I've got more to say about parallels in healthcare, but I think maybe I should come back to that. I don't want to take too much time.
Sure. So. Great. Thank you. Thank you very much, John. So a tiny, minuscule amount of money, but actually part of a huge shift and pattern, I think would be my kind of takeaway from your comments there, John. I think something that I feel has been underexplored, at least in the plenary sessions, is the potential for these sorts of principles, because I think we sort of agreed that they're principles rather than necessarily tools or models, but the potential for some of these principles in developing economies and international development space, because I think the point has been made, but not really explored fully, that context really matters here. And, you know, some of the other, if you like, alternative approaches, and we'll come back to that idea in a minute, that are being put forward, rely on certain contextual factors and a high degree of trust, and in some places you just don't have that. So in fact, perhaps there is more potential for some of these ideas in those sorts of economies. And that is an idea I would like to put to you, Abha, to speak on behalf of the entire international development community and every developing economy in the world. No, I'm joking, but from your own perspective, what do you think, similar really to the question I put to John, what do you think is interesting about these from that perspective?
Thank you, and thank you for having me on this panel. I can see we've lost a few people, but hoping that we still keep it as interesting and engaging as today has been. I represent the British Asian Trust. We're a small non-profit, and we work across South Asia. 20% of the world lives in South Asia, to lead social change work in areas such as anti-trafficking, mental health, education, livelihoods. And this is a point of difference. I'm neither government, nor a direct delivery NGO, nor a commissioner. We came at it from 10 years of experience of having used grant funding to deliver work and asking ourselves if there was a different way to deliver social change. Even today, when I look at a log frame, I break into a rash, as my team knows. And at the end of a log frame, you normally are checking how the bills have gone as against what the outcomes are. And 10 years of doing that made us wonder whether there were different ways to do it. And that's the genesis of the work at our organization. And that continues to be our guiding light. Is there a different way when compared to grant? Because grant is the primary tool we use for social change work in philanthropy, with aid, and the sectors we work in. So when you come at it like that, you actually don't have the 10 years that I have on either side of my, on my panel, 10 years of having done SIBS, but actually you come from 10 years of having done something else. So at every point, when you're adopting or adapting a model, you're thinking about where you're coming from and what you perhaps got wrong in some other world. And that's hopefully the perspective that the international development community brings to this place. We are listening, watching, but it's not poor solutions being borrowed for poor problems or poor people. It's about taking the best of those solutions and improving it. And the cat analogy yesterday made me think quite hard about an analogy that might be a positive one here today as against a negative one. And if I may, I'll use it now, and I'll come back to the more serious parts of my notes, is my Gujarati mother-in-law who cooks every day when I'm here working for my children. And every recipe she makes is not from a cookbook, it's from her mind. And then we sit down for dinner, and then she criticizes the meal. Oh, the onions are terrible, the cumin's not enough. And when I married my husband, she would do this. I would just think, can she never enjoy a meal? Can't she share in the joy of eating what is a spectacular dish? But I did realize that dissection and that sort of pulling it apart made every meal that she cooked after that a better meal. And I take these 2 days with that spirit, that the unpackaging that's happened from the UK community here is hopefully for us international development practitioners, and I can see several of us in the room, something that's helping us make the recipe a better one. It's not about the fact that a cat can't be put back together. It's that recipes need to be adapted to the context you work with. And I bring that. So I think that I had to say that because it really, really bothered me yesterday. That was what everybody was left with in the evening. I'm going to come back to the deeper questions. I've taken away quite a few things in ways which you've adapted them in the international space. But let me move on to the rest of the panel and answer more specific questions. I wanted to leave that thought with you as we bring it alive with examples.
Great, thank you very much, Abha. I actually would like to skip to you next, Tom, if I may, and then I'll come back to you, David. So Abha mentioned grant funding. Grant funding is an alternative to social impact bond funding. There are other alternatives. We've talked about lots of them over these 2 days. And, you know, there are proponents and opponents, pros and cons to all of the different approaches. So from your perspective, working in the civil service, why do you feel like SIBS perhaps deserve a privileged position amongst all of those approaches, or indeed do they?
Thank you, Nigel. Also, just let me start again by thanking you and the team here for laying on such a brilliant conference and sort of talking to people who've been here through the 3 years of it, just how it's growing into such a terrific event. And this is the first time I've been. It's been terrific, so thank you. I don't think SIBS deserve a privileged position at all. I mean, I think they're one of a number of different approaches. And I think maybe one of my observations is, you know, the culture at the moment in civil service in Whitehall there isn't a dominant ideology, I would say, at the moment, and that's for all sorts of political reasons. But what you don't have is a government with and haven't had for several years, I would say, actually. I mean, certainly not since the kind of early parts of this decade when there was a government which did have a few, you know, which did have certain quite sort of clear and coherent program and philosophy in public sector. I wouldn't characterize the current government or the last few years of having such a sort of here's our philosophy of public service reform. And I think one of the consequences of that is it actually creates more opportunities for people to be trying different approaches in different places. And I think that the role of SIBS now is very much in that context, that SIB is one of a number of approaches that people are adopting. What I don't hear is anybody arguing that SIBS are the answer to public services. I don't think they ever did, but they're certainly not arguing that now. And what it has created, I think, is an opportunity for people to reflect on where SIBS are proving to be helpful and expand those. So certainly when we talk to ministers, when we talk to senior officials around government, and this comes a bit back to Stefan's observations yesterday about what is it that really drives interest inside government in SIBS. My view of the kind of the predominant driver is that there are some very long-standing social challenges in the country, some of them particularly ones around individuals who have very multiple and complex needs. And the list of problems that John talked about there is a good one of those. And these are issues and challenges that have proved to be, deeply intractable for many years. These aren't new problems, these are quite old and long-standing problems. And I think what we're learning in the very early days of SIBS in the last few years is, there are reasons to believe that SIBS can be effective ways of dealing with some of those quite entrenched challenges. So if I look at rough sleeping as an example, there have been SIBS which have been successful or there is evidence that they've been successful in addressing rough sleeping. And when the government published its rough sleeping strategy last year, it was one of the first strategies, I think, anywhere in the world that said, in dealing with this specific social problem, we're going to use SIBS as a really part of the core mainstream solution, but to this very specific social challenge. And I think everyone in the room would share the view, why is it that SIBS or SIB-like instruments, outcome payments, are so helpful and seem to offer some solutions for those types of problems? And I think the answer is, it's been reflected in some of the conversations in the last 2 days, is it does create a space where the service provider can focus on the needs of that particular complex individual. These are not individuals for whom a prepackaged solution can work. These are individuals where it's based upon the ability of service providers to be able to develop kind of long-standing relationships with those individuals. And my favorite example of this is when we took our minister to visit one of the London rough sleeping SIBS, and one of the beneficiaries of this, who was now in stable accommodation, basically explained to her why it had worked so well. And he said, normally when we receive these services, people come and the rough sleeper on the street will tell them to F off, basically. He didn't modify his language. He said, that's what they say. Much to the delight of our minister, I'm pleased to say. But in a SIB model, that outreach worker can keep on going back and keep on going back. And after 6 months, they build up a relationship with that person, which enables the particular issues and requirements of that individual to be met. And that's very difficult. That creates the space for that kind of relationship, which allows for some of these really very deep and very intractable problems to be addressed. So, at its core, I think that is what's attractive to people about SIBS. Now, there are all sorts of technical issues that we've talked about, but for those kinds of issues, I do think they hold out great potential.
And I think something we reflected on before this panel, and that I hope many of you in the room would agree with, is that there's some definite consensus that's emerged out of the discussions over these past several days. One is that actually flexibility in the way that delivery happens and adaptation and feedback loops are a good thing, and we want more of that. I think, that's, everyone kind of agrees with that. Everyone agrees that collaboration between different stakeholders aligned around particular goals is a good thing. We've got a consensus around those things. And we've got those in SIBS and we've got those outside of SIBS. So in a way, we would need to be very careful about creating a sort of false opposition here. That SIBS are one thing, and then there's these other things, and actually they're starting to, SIBS have lost their sheen a little bit, and these things are looking quite shiny, glinting out from under their rock, and perhaps we should do that instead. Well, there is no instead actually here. As we said, there's a set of principles which are good and which SIBS may enable, and other things may also enable. And I think that's, building on your point, Tom, part of the appeal here. But one of the other things that's come up is this idea of legitimacy. And in fact, we heard at the start of the conference about a delivery crisis across public services, and we later heard that actually there's a legitimacy crisis in public services as well. And one of the ways to increase legitimacy is transparency. And SIBS, one of their benefits is that their mechanism relies on measurement of outcomes. And you know, in fact, that's very conducive to increasing transparency. So, and this is where I want to bring you in, David. You know, is there a degree to which, and you've commented, you know, SIBs were born out of a desire to increase legitimacy. Do you think they've achieved that? And what needs to perhaps happen more in order for SIBs to be seen as a tool of increasing legitimacy for the delivery of public services?
Well, I think that, just to comment on your original question, I was staggered at how much interest the first SIB generated. And it obviously touched a nerve. And in retrospect, what I think it did was to balance the interests of three parties who don't normally work together in a coherent way. We had to work hard at that, and I think one of the things we need to come back to on what makes a good SIB is the strength of the governance around it to balance those interests. But I think what it did do was create a safe space, as Tom's described, for people to develop the long-term relationships that any social scientist, any voluntary sector frontline worker will acknowledge are the key to driving long-term change. And they protected in such a way that it was there for a multi-year period. The expectations of change are way out of line with what's possible. And I think one other thing, which I think was a feature of the first one, was that we were not, if you like, measuring distance travelled. That actually the outcome we were all assigned to deliver was 4 years out from measurement. And that led to an openness, a transparency, and a sense of joint endeavour, which is quite difficult to create when a number of more recent SIBs have worked on near-term soft outcomes, distance travel metrics, which then I think confuse what is at the heart, the power of the model. But if this is going to be a legitimate way of working, it has to be a basis on which some of these complex problems, and I agree with Tom that that is where the model is most powerful, does allow these relationships to develop, and people have the space to deepen those over many, many months and years.
Good. And any comments on the transparency piece? Do you have a view on that?
I do. I mean, I think, look, I mean, there are three parties in a conventional SIB that need to come together, but the one fundamentally that really has to drive the agenda is the outcome payer. And I think there is an awful lot of data around, and not all of it is disclosed, but I think there's no problem with disclosing it. In fact, if in some ways, a lot of the data that's been captured is totally unhelpful to informing some of the key decisions. And if I think through what really is at the heart of a commissioner's mind when they think about this structure, the whole question of attribution is fundamental. The confidence that there is something in this way of working which is definitely an improvement on a contract for services, and then the value of the outcome. And frankly, we are in the foothills. We haven't even begun to develop a coherent answer to certainly 2 and 3 there. I was very struck by the example in the previous description about how different it was to deliver outcomes in Grimsby and Luton. And how can you take the value of an outcome delivered in Luton and compare it with the value of an outcome delivered in Grimsby? And so I think people are searching for nirvana, which doesn't exist at the moment. And my plea, if we're really going to move this forward, is that there is an honest approach taken to actually run a series of programs in parallel under different commissioning structures. Because what commissioners need is a safe space, a safe harbour to conduct this sort of exercise. Commissioning a service on a standard basis is relatively risk-free. Firstly, you design it. You control certain service level delivery. You then probably are replacing an existing budget line with something that's less. And you go out to tender, and you get the cheapest bid. And so at each stage, you're taking risk out of the commissioner's decision. And also, it's very rapid to do. And I think one of the challenges that we have moving to this different environment is actually structuring these contracts, thinking through the appropriate outcome, the appropriate value, and the procurement process are really difficult. And until we actually acknowledge that and celebrate the bravery of some of the commissioners out there who do it, we'll constantly end up with some of the negative feedback that's been circulating in this room.
Good. Yeah. I think that would be very helpful if we had some sort of objective evidence about the comparative approaches. But as you say, it's very difficult because context really matters, and it's something that keeps coming up.
Is a way of saying that actually allowing the market in any particular location to come forward with a solution is a way in which you deal with context. And the beauty of the SIB is it doesn't have to be the same model in every setting.
Right. Yeah. So I know panelists have got further thoughts to share, but I want to give the room an opportunity to chip in or ask questions or provoke challenges, because we like those, if you've got any left in you at this stage of the game. So there's a question here from James. Do we have some mics? Yeah. So one here and one at the back there. We'll take maybe 3 at a time. Is there a third? And Georgia here. So we'll go to Georgia first, since the mic's there.
Thank you. Georgia Efremova from the European Commission. I was actually very intrigued by the last suggestion of how a commissioner or a public body would run this experiment. It's certainly very intriguing. Would you give a few more thoughts about it? How would you do it? How big would it have to be? Does it have to be all in the same location, by the same... Can you give some more food for thought?
Raising some very practical and very important observations. You want to control for as few factors as possible. But ultimately, and I'm hearing in one government department in this country, the idea of commissioning 5 services. 3 would be done on a traditional fee-for-service, and 2 would be done on the basis of outcomes. And if we can get to that in the next 12 months, I think that would be a massive step forward in really addressing the most important issue. And the one that leads to all the neurosis that comes with, how can I possibly justify paying a price which allows someone to earn a return for risk? That question stands in the way. What commissioners do not understand is the risk transfer and the value of the risk transfer. If we were to run that exercise, there are a whole set of questions we could make a lot of progress on.
It would also be remiss of me not to mention that as part of our work and some of the evaluation work we're doing in conjunction with the government's Life Chances Fund, we are trying to answer the same question. We're looking for opportunities where we can get, and in fact we have a couple, so we're very excited, where we can actually do that comparison. So yeah, so I was going to say, yeah, well, I didn't want to really say that, yeah, but you might have to wait a few years for that one. Keep coming back and we'll keep you updated. There's a question here from James and one at the back there from Patrick.
I do have a question. I also wanted to give an answer, just to build on George's question, because I have been pushing this myself, because I think until you do this, you really don't know the answer. But perhaps a nerdy thought I've always been having, though, is can you really do it? Because I think you'd get SIB spillover effects. Because one of the argued benefits of a SIB is the clear definition of and measurement of outcomes. So if you're going to do a true SIB, non-SIB comparison, you then have to clearly define and measure the outcomes in the non-SIB, which maybe you wouldn't have done if you were only doing that because you're comparing it to the SIB. So would that have ever happened? So I think there's all kinds of complexities.
Just on that one, I mean, it seems tough to impose on the SIB a tougher standard than you would do on a normal government contract. I mean, if a SIB is all about sitting down in advance and thinking out through what you want to achieve and how you assess whether you achieve it, and then during the process of delivery, assessing whether you are achieving it and retrospectively working out whether the programme delivered it, shouldn't government be doing that with all spending? And so,
yes.
So my question is, if you're going to run a controlled experiment, you should, as far as possible. I agree there is a spillover if there is a clear focus on outcomes in one project in the way it's delivered versus the other. But I think we have to understand the difference between those two environments much more fully than we do at the moment.
Can I sort of pick up on that? Because I think your point, James, points to one of the reasons why people find SIBs attractive is exactly what you're suggesting, is that you can, as people have talked about, create rich data environments and the right monitoring networks outside a SIB or an outcome structure. But people often don't have the confidence that that will be done or that will be sustained through the programme after the initial interest. So I think that there's a social element to the SIB which merely by the form of the structure obliges people to think through some of these problems. One of the ways in which I think we might see this all develop in the next few years is I think the Educate Girls example is a very good one, is that people use a SIB and the SIB structure brings out all sorts of data and monitoring, and then they move on and they implement it in a different structure. But I think your point is it's the mechanism of the SIB that forces people to understand and think through some issues which they could have done in another structure, but they don't.
Or the people doing it, and the bigger organizations, different data shows that the payments by results contracts were taken, 95% of them went to very large INGOs, and not the smaller innovators like Educate Girls and other nonprofits who perhaps might have the better ideas. So a DIB or a SIB would actually allow a smaller provider to partake in a solution which normally they may not have the working capital to do that in a clean payments by results piece, which is a huge motivator for us to do what we do. Lots of answers to your questions, James.
Can I also ask my question, or is that cheeky as to Dominic?
Yeah, go ahead.
My question was for Abha, which I find it really interesting that you said you're coming at this from 10 years of grants, and most people that are involved in these from the sort of outcome funder perspective are sort of governments. And loads of the questions over the last 2 days has been, is this better than a grant? You could do that through a grant. Why don't you just give a grant? So I'm really curious as to your view on 10 years of grants. Maybe we can do this differently. How would you, it might be too early, but how would you compare your experience of DIBs against your experience of giving out grants?
Like two different worlds. No grant ever fails. I have always given successful grant reports in 10 years. In my first year of our DIB, we have just removed a program because we've embraced failure and realized one of our programs didn't work and we had to take it out. And it was hard. It really threw us doing that. I'd never done it before. 1 year later, I'd be doing things to try and find reasons why that could have gone better in a grant program. In this program, I had to be ruthless about outcomes. So it's very, very different. So that's sort of a very real way to show you how grant is different. The second is the relationships and the equality of relationships. In grant, the funder gives the money, the provider does the work. There isn't a way in which you've equally agreed what the outcomes you're doing. And the funder is always dominating the conversation on expenditure lines and input lines and have you done this and have you had 4 workshops or 3 sessions or 2.5 things. While the provider who might have decided to start doing that, but halfway through the program realizes that is not the best way to deliver outcomes, might be changing those inputs. And they never have that freedom unless you go back to not even to DFID, it's the provider between DFID and us you have to go back to tell them you're changing the way you're delivering a piece of work. You don't have to do that in an outcomes contract, in a development impact bond. So there are many more answers than that, James, but if that helps you, we are really enjoying it. We know it's early days and there's a lot to learn, but just that, this sheer experience of looking at the results, making decisions, changing course, it's liberating.
I have to say, I've been struck over these 2 days by another theme, which is that often, I know you're coming from a slightly different perspective, Abha, but providers who have done social impact bonds tend to say good things about them, certainly the ones we've heard about. Again, I know there's a big sample bias, but anecdotally, there's definitely something further to explore that, despite the limitations, charities seem to like working in this way. So it's clearly, for them, an improvement on what's come before, and that's something I think we definitely need to account for. There was another question from you, Patrick, at the back.
Thank you. Does this work? Yeah. Thank you. I'm Patrick from the Public Employment Service in Flanders. We are experimenting somewhat on SIPs too. My question, maybe first a remark to Abha. I agree the freedom is very interesting, but I disagree that it's linked to SIPs. It's linked to smart buying, in my opinion. But to David, if you are comparing SIPs with other possible contracts, are you sure what you are measuring? Are you measuring the effect of the financial pressure? Or are you measuring the value of putting 2 worlds together and getting a professional growth in your organization? And if so, are there not cheaper solution for reaching that?
So I fully understand your question. You're saying, my understanding is the ambition would measure whether a better set of outcomes or more positive outcomes were delivered by one route versus another. I don't think it's anything more complicated than that. I think you do want to do some more qualitative work about what sort of difference there is in the environment in which the service is being delivered. And as Abha says, if you are working with third parties, the flexibility they have to reallocate their activities away from what was perhaps more tightly specified in a particular contract. So I think the things you'll be looking to understand, at the end of the day, have we delivered more positive outcomes under one route than another? And if there are particular factors which made it easier in one area than another, you'll have to control for that. So I'm not suggesting this is at all easy, but I think there are also qualitative judgments about the sort of change that could be achieved. I'm not involved in specifying these, and I think it's a thought experiment. It's a really exciting one, and one we need to get right. I do think, though, coming back to your observation on Abha's comment, that I have not seen smart commissioning. Commissioners are very concerned to make sure that if they are spending public money, they know exactly what they're getting for it, and therefore they're very focused on specifying very closely what that money is used for and how it's delivered. And their willingness to allow flexibility outside of that is more limited. They may, obviously through the definition of KPIs, allow people some flexibility, but at the end of the day, the way in which money flows is by delivering a service in a certain way, because that is how it's being designed. There is very little money that's spent as purely a flexible grant. And so I think the real question is, are you comparing this delivery environment with a small grant environment, or are you dealing with a contract for services? I think the SIB should be held accountable against the latter in order to get the proper understanding of the environment.
Good, thank you very much. Conscious of time, and the previous panel ran on, I would like to leave it there. If there's any burning issues that any of you would like to raise as a closing remark, John, do you have anything to...
Yes, thank you. So I would like to finish the story I began to tell of how PFS, as I said, got a lot of success and attention in the U.S., but remained really quite small. It was concurrent with the major health reform. But the third part of the story that I think builds on what we've just been talking about the possibility of doing these sorts of projects, is not only did the health reform of 2010 include a major expansion of coverage, but it also further accelerated something that was underway, and that's transitioning the Medicaid program and much of healthcare more broadly from a fee-for-service funding structure to a managed care funding structure. And with the managed care funding structure, there's a fixed payment to the providers by the government. There are requirements of quality and covering certain sorts of care and procedures. There's an emphasis on prevention. There's a shifting of risk, those sorts of things. So the original then thought was, well, should we still do a SIB project? So you've got now this managed care, Medicaid managed care, serving the low-income person or the disadvantaged person, and doing a good job at its best of coordinating services and being more holistic and being more thinking longer term and being prevention-oriented and all of those kinds of things. Should we do a SIB project anyway? Could we graft a traditional SIB project onto it? And I was at Department of Health and Human Services, and we thought very seriously about this and really explored what those sorts of projects would look like. And for a variety of just complexities that arose of financial and legal and budgetary and bureaucratic, realized it just didn't seem to be feasible. But then when we stepped back, we realized it wasn't necessary. And the reason it wasn't necessary was because managed care, again, in concept and at its best, reflects these key principles of the prevention, the flexible funding, the aligning incentives, the focus on outcomes and performance, leveraging private investment, doing all of these things without having to, you can call it a SIB or not, but without having to actually try to graft an actual SIB onto that. But the difference between managed care and the traditional SIB model, the traditional model, of course, being transferring all the risk, only pay if there's full success, so you might be paying nothing, the investor is therefore assuming 100% of the risk, et cetera, has not been necessary in managed care. Rather, there's a structure of being able to provide modest performance incentives and penalties to the providers if they're failing to meet certain requirements, if they're having subpar outcomes. And we found that that's sufficient to incent better performance and to have them thinking creatively and proactively about how to improve. But once you then are in an environment in which you just have the modest performance bonus or penalty, you can get away from the third-party financing. that the larger managed care organizations, which themselves have access to the capital markets, the for-profit ones and the nonprofit ones have access to philanthropy, are able to basically absorb that risk themselves, and in doing so, we're able to get away from the complexity of the SIB projects. So, and the SIB field then has, in the U.S., moved toward that kind of model of modest performance bonuses and penalties rather than the all-or-nothing payments. Some of the states that are at the forefront of doing this, such as Connecticut, have moved toward that, of just offering a 5% performance bonus, finding that that's enough to really incent organizations to work to improve. George Overholzer, founder of Third Sector Capital, had a brilliant essay last summer where he called for radical simplification of SIBs and PFS. And the radical simplification was moving toward these modest performance bonuses, and in doing so, getting away from the third-party funder and having to bring in the investor, and in doing then, having all kinds of simplification and reducing overhead cost and complexity that is overcoming sort of the things that many of us agree have been hampering SIB projects. So there's a respect in which managed care in the U.S. anticipated SIBs in some ways. It reflects the core principles. It's doing so on a scale that's just exponentially larger than what PFS projects have been able to do. So I don't know if it's to infinity and beyond, but it's approaching that. It's a program that's, again, $600 billion in spending, 80 million recipients, half of all children born are within the program. It's not entirely managed care, it's moving toward that. The rest of the healthcare system is moving toward that increasingly. Medicare, which is for elderly, moving toward that, but more slowly. So there's a respect in which, I mean, SIBs cannot claim success for this, but those core principles are embodied in managed care, which is, again, far and away, which is so much of healthcare, which is our largest funding stream for low-income and disadvantaged persons. So to that extent, there's sort of a lot of work to do. And a lot of these principles are actually being applied very successfully in practice. So I don't know. It's a reason for optimism. I think
I'm very glad you finished the story, because I think it's a terrific note to end on, actually, and it's a real note of optimism. And that something could be adopt principles that we broadly agree on, be much simpler, and be done at that sort of scale feels to me like a reason for hope. So the perfect closing note. Thank you ever so much, not just to you, John, but to all of our panelists. Thank you. Okay. Before you go, there is just a few closing remarks to say. I'm going to stand up to share them. Bear with me, very brief. One is that you may have heard we've just launched a new platform. Have you all heard that? There's a new platform that we've launched. Do check it out. I know we've really rammed the point home, but it's got a great directory on there. Make sure your organization's signed up. We've got a database full of SIB data and loads of excellent technical guidance. Go and have a look. We've had a few requests to put people in touch with each other. If you can't look each other up on LinkedIn, please get in touch with us. We will make those connections for you. We're very happy to do so. We've had several requests to share slides, which we will do. If you have been a presenter and you do not want us to share your slides after the conference, please let us know as soon as possible, i.e. before you leave today, preferably, so that we make sure that they don't go up online. Next year, this conference will be on the 10th and 11th of September. As Executive Director, I would like to take an executive decision that it's in Munich, in a Munich beer hall. And I'm very much looking forward to talking data in Munich with you all next year. And finally, and I think most importantly, I have to give thanks, huge thanks to the GoLab team. It's a fabulous team. I think I'll speak for Mara and myself in saying we feel very fortunate because we just sort of, show up in the morning and everything's happening beautifully. And it's because it's just a team that works in amazing harmony. Everyone kind of does their own thing and plays to their own strengths, and also, like an orchestra, plays in beautiful harmony. So anyway, it's a great team, and I really do want to big them up. And please, if you see any of them, you know, let's thank our team. There is one person in particular who the entire team would agree deserves particular and special thanks. This person has to do all of the not very nice jobs, make himself or herself unpopular. Quite often, you know, the person that's always ushering us back into the next session and constantly worrying about every single little detail to make sure that you will have a really, really good experience. So it can feel like quite a thankless task. We want to make sure that person's adequately thanked. So, Andrea, please could you come to the front?
Well, thank you. No, thanks everyone. It's been a real honor and such high caliber of participants, and it's been a really easy job. Despite me being a bit stressy at times, but it's been brilliant, so I hope people will enjoy it.
Brilliant. Great. Thank you all very much. Do stick around. You can have a bit of a break, but we've got a great final session coming up and some new faces joining us for a discussion between Joe Wolf and Tom Hall from UBS. Andrea's waving that I've forgotten to say something. Ah, yes, thank you. Yes. Of course, I was going to forget something, wasn't it? This is why we love Andrea. So please do give your feedback to us via Slido. We ask you for a rating and then some what you liked and what you didn't like, and we'll make it even better next year. So please do give us your feedback. Please do stick around. It's going to be a really interesting discussion. What is a democratic right? What is a philanthropic gift? And thank you all very much indeed for coming from all over the world to join us for these fascinating discussions. Thank you.